everybody, welcome to this deep dive all about trees. So you guys sent in some seriously interesting stuff for this one. Chapters from a forestry book, a few scientific articles, even some historical anecdotes. And we're going to dig through it all today, pull out the most fascinating and useful things about trees.
That sounds like a fun challenge.
Oh, definitely is.
Yeah.
And believe me, there's some seriously surprising stuff in here. For example, did you know that the oldest living organism on Earth is a tree?
I did not know that. Which one is it?
Bristlecone pine. Over 5,000 years old. Wow. Think about all the changes that tree has seen.
It really makes you think about our own place in history, doesn't it? And speaking of history, it's amazing how ancient cultures like the Egyptians and the Romans, they really revered trees, not just for practical use, but as symbols that were deeply woven into their cultural and spiritual practices.
Yeah, and they even had sacred groves. These areas carefully protected for their symbolic and ecological importance.
It's a reminder that our relationship with trees goes back thousands of years.
Absolutely. And speaking of how trees work, the forestry guide you sent in does a great job explaining the basics of tree biology. They're like these incredible self-contained ecosystems. Photosynthesis, absorbing nutrients, transporting water. It's all happening inside this one organism.
It's mind-boggling when you really think about it. The complexity of a tree. It's not just a trunk and some leaves, it's a whole interconnected system. The roots, the trunk, the branches, leaves, they all work together, totally interdependent. And from a tiny seed, a tree grows into a sapling and eventually reaches maturity, playing a vital role in the forest ecosystem. It's a cycle of resilience and interconnectedness. That's a powerful metaphor for it.
A lot of things, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so we've got this amazing organism playing a vital role in its environment. And that brings us to something super important, sustainable forestry. The guide emphasizes finding that balance between human needs, using trees for timber and so on, and making sure forests stay healthy.
Yeah, that's the key, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Finding that balance. And one of the key concepts they highlight is selective logging. It's not just clear-cutting everything. You carefully choose which trees to harvest, leaving the rest to keep growing. It's a much more sustainable approach.
Exactly. That's like managing a bank account, right? You can't just keep withdrawing without making deposit. Same with forests. The guide actually uses Costa Rica as a great example. They have a program that pays landowners to preserve forests, and it's been so successful they've actually reversed deforestation. Over half their land is now covered in forest.
That's incredible.
It's a really inspiring example.
It is. It really shows that sustainable practices can work, and they can be incredibly effective both for the environment and the economy.
For sure. Okay, so we've talked about how trees work and how to manage them sustainably. Of course, trees face all sorts of challenges too. And the sources you sent mentioned some pretty serious threats, especially from diseases and pests that can wipe out entire forests.
Right, and those are becoming more and more common, unfortunately.
Yeah, like the Dutch elm disease.
Oh yeah, that one's devastating.
This fungal disease spread by beetles. It has killed millions of elm trees.
It's heartbreaking to think about.
It is. And then there's the emerald ash borer, another invasive species that's decimating ash trees across North America.
Yeah, these invasive pests and diseases, they can spread so quickly and cause so much damage.
They can. And it seems like early detection and management are crucial in these situations. If we can catch these threats early on, we have a much better chance of containing them.
Absolutely.
It makes you realize how fragile these ecosystems can be.
They really are. And it's not just about protecting individual trees, it's about protecting the whole system.
Exactly. And speaking of fragility, there's that incredibly sad story of the American chestnut tree. It was practically wiped out by a blight in the early 20th century. A whole species almost gone.
It's a stark reminder of what's at stake.
It really is. It shows the devastation these threats can cause and how crucial proactive management is.
And there's no single solution either. Sometimes it's pesticides, sometimes introducing natural predators, sometimes a mix of approaches. It really depends on the specific situation.
So what you're saying is there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Exactly. And that's part of what makes forestry so challenging and so rewarding.
It sounds like it. All right, so we've talked about forests and the threats they face. Let's shift our focus now to trees and cities. The sources you shared highlight the unique challenges, but also the opportunities of managing trees in urban settings.
Yeah, cities are a whole different environment.
They are. What are some of the challenges trees face in urban areas?
Well, pollution is a big one, and then there's limited space, often pretty harsh conditions.
I can imagine trying to grow in concrete.
Right, exactly. But despite those challenges, trees offer huge benefits in cities. They improve air quality, reduce the urban heat island effect, and they just make urban spaces more pleasant to live in.
The guide actually mentions a really cool example. Melbourne, Australia. They've implemented a really comprehensive urban forest strategy, choosing tree species that thrive in those specific conditions. And it's resulted in a much greener city and fewer management issues.
It's amazing what's possible when you plan thoughtfully, even in urban environments.
It really is.
Yeah.
And I think more and more cities are realizing that integrating nature into urban spaces is essential for creating healthier, more livable cities.
I completely agree.
Okay, so we've talked about managing trees in forests and in cities. What about managing trees on our own property? The sources we have get into some practical advice for that, especially in terms of understanding local laws and regulations.
Right, because there are often rules about how close you can plant a tree to your property line, for example. And being a good neighbor is really important too.
Yeah, absolutely.
What if your neighbor's tree is dropping leaves all over your yard, or branches are hanging over your property line? You got to communicate and find solutions that work for both of you.
It's all about being proactive and thinking about the long term. Like planting a fast-growing tree might seem like a good idea now, but what happens when it gets huge and outgrows your yard? You might end up having to remove it, which can be costly.
Exactly. It's about being a responsible steward of the trees you're responsible for.
But let's not forget about invasive species too.
Oh yeah, those can cause some serious problems.
The guide mentions kudzu vine. That stuff grows like crazy up to a foot a day, smothering everything in its path.
It's a good example of how introducing non-native species can have unintended consequences.
And it's a reminder that we need to be careful about what we plant, even in our own backyard.
Absolutely. We need to be responsible stewards of the environment.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. From the basics of tree biology to the complexities of sustainable forestry, and even the challenges and opportunities of managing trees in different environments. But there's still so much more to explore.
There is. We haven't even touched on the role of technology in forestry or the impact of climate change.
That's right. We'll delve into those topics and more in our next deep dive, so stay tuned for that.
It's going to be fascinating.
It is. And in the meantime, keep those questions coming. We love hearing from you.
We do.
All right, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of tree. We'll see you next time for another exciting exploration. Until then, stay curious.
And stay tremendous.
I like that.
You know, thinking about responsibility, one thing the guidebook really emphasizes is the importance of risk assessment when it comes to trees, especially on private property.
Yeah, that makes sense. Trees can be beautiful and beneficial, but they can also pose some serious risks if they're not properly cared for.
Exactly. We're talking about things like falling branches, roots, damaging infrastructure, even the whole tree coming down in a storm.
The guidebook even uses the term widowmaker to describe a broken branch just hanging there waiting to fall.
It definitely is. That's why regular inspections are so important. You need to be on the lookout for signs of disease, pest damage, or any structural weakness.
So it's not just about admiring the beauty of a tree. It's also about understanding the potential danger. And I guess that's where knowing a bit about tree biology comes in handy, right?
Absolutely. And it's not just the tree itself, it's also about the environment and things like soil type, climate, even the tree's location relative to structure. All of these factors play a role.
So a tree that's perfectly healthy in a forest might actually pose a risk if it's planted too close to your house or a power line.
Right. And once you've assessed the risks, there are things you can do to manage them. The guidebook talks about preventative measures like pruning and cabling, as well as reactive measures like removing a hazardous tree.
Tree removal, that sounds pretty drastic.
It is, and it should always be a last resort. Trees provide so many benefits, so removing them should only be done when absolutely necessary, but sometimes it's the safest option.
That makes sense. It's about weighing the risks and benefits, I guess. And speaking of benefits, let's shift gears and talk about the economic value of trees. I know this goes beyond just the price of lumber, right?
Absolutely. Trees contribute to our economy in so many ways. They increase property values, reduce energy costs through shade and windbreak. They attract tourists, provide jobs, and even generate revenue through carbon credit.
Wow, I hadn't thought about all of that. The guidebook mentions a study that found homes with trees in the front yard sold for an average of $7,000 more than those without.
It really is. Trees are more than just aesthetic addition. They have real, tangible economic value.
And of course, we can't forget about the role trees play in supporting wildlife and biodiversity.
Absolutely. Trees provide food and shelter for countless species. From insects to birds to mammals, they're essential for maintaining healthy, functioning ecosystems.
The guidebook gives the example of the white oak tree. Its acorns are a vital food source for deer squirrels, even some bird species. It's amazing how interconnected everything is.
Really, it's like a giant web, and trees are a major thread holding it all together.
Speaking of history, I found it fascinating how the guidebook pointed out that ancient civilizations like the Egyptians and Romans had really sophisticated systems for managing their forests. They understood that trees were more than just resources. They were integral to their culture and spirituality.
That's so true. It's fascinating how our understanding of forests has evolved over time, for centuries. We mainly saw forests as sources of timber, but today we recognize their broader ecological and social value.
And that shift in perspective has really led to the rise of sustainable forestry practices, hasn't it?
Exactly. It's about managing forests in a way that balances our need for timber with the long-term health and resilience of the ecosystem.
And technology is playing a huge role in modern forestry, too. The guidebook talks about tools like remote sensing, which uses satellites to monitor forests from space and GIS, which helps map and analyze forest data.
It's incredible how these technologies are giving us an unprecedented understanding of our forests. We can track deforestation, identify areas of disease or pest outbreaks, and even model how forests might respond to climate change.
It's like having a whole new set of eyes on the forest, isn't it? And speaking of community, it seems like that's becoming more and more important in forestry, too. The guidebook mentioned a growing trend of community-led initiatives focused on forest restoration, sustainable harvesting, and even ecotourism.
That's a really positive development. It's about recognizing that forests aren't just about trees, they're about people, too. They provide livelihoods, cultural value, and even spiritual significance for many communities.
It's about that interconnectedness again, right? Seeing forests as part of a larger social and ecological system.
Exactly. And that's something we need to keep in mind as we face the challenges of the 21st century, especially climate change.
Speaking of challenges, there's no doubt that climate change is the biggest threat facing our forests today.
Without a doubt, we're already seeing changes in temperature, rainfall patterns, and the frequency of extreme weather events, all of which have a huge impact on forests.
The guidebook describes a phenomenon called assisted migration, where scientists are actually moving tree species to new areas to help them adapt to these changing climate conditions.
It's a controversial strategy for sure, but it's one that's gaining traction as the impacts of climate change become more and more apparent. It really makes you think about what the future of our forests might look like and how we can best help them adapt.
It's a big question. Of course, reducing our own carbon footprint is crucial too. Deforestation is a major contributor to climate change. So preserving existing forests and planting new trees is essential.
So trees are incredibly effective at absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, so they're a vital part of any climate change mitigation strategy.
So from a climate change perspective, trees are both part of the problem and part of the solution.
Exactly. It's a complex issue, but one that we can't afford to ignore. And speaking of complex issues, managing trees in urban environments presents its own unique set of challenges.
Cities are tough places for trees to survive with all the pollution-limited space and often harsh growing conditions.
That's why careful species selection is so important. You need trees that are tolerant of open stresses like compacted soil and air pollution.
So it's not just about planting any old tree, it's about choosing the right tree for the right place.
Exactly. And it's about more than just survival. We want trees that thrive in urban environments, providing all those benefits we talked about earlier, shade booty and ecological benefits.
The guidebook highlights those benefits, talking about how urban forests can help reduce the urban heat island effect, improve air quality, and even boost people's mental well-being.
It's amazing how much impact trees can have on our city. Even in small spaces, they're like little oases of nature amidst all the concrete and steel.
But managing urban trees requires a different approach than managing forests, right?
You're absolutely right. It's about working with the constraints of the built environment. Pruning is essential to prevent branches from interfering with power lines or buildings, and root management is crucial to avoid damage to infrastructure.
Sounds like a delicate balancing act. And the guidebook also mentions the importance of community involvement in urban forestry. We're seeing more and more citizen-led tree planting initiatives, community gardens, even urban farms popping up in cities.
That's a really positive trend. It's about bringing nature back into our cities and reconnecting people with the natural world. And speaking of private property, that's where things can get a bit tricky when it comes to tree management, especially regarding legalities.
Yeah, the guidebook mentions that you really need to be aware of your local laws and regulations regarding tree removal, pruning, and even planting.
Absolutely. There are often rules in place, and ignoring them can lead to fines or even legal action.
The guidebook actually tells a story about two neighbors who ended up in court over a tree that straddled their property line.
It's a reminder that trees can sometimes be a source of conflict, so it's important to be proactive, communicate with your neighbors, and understand your rights and responsibilities.
And of course, we can't forget about homeowners associations, or HOAs.
Right, they often have very specific rules about tree management on your property.
So whether you're dealing with a single tree in your backyard or a whole forest, the guidebook emphasizes the importance of regular inspections and maintenance.
Exactly. It's about being a responsible steward of the trees under your care.
And let's not forget about the growing threat of invasive species.
You're right. Invasive species can cause a lot of damage to our native ecosystem. The guidebook mentions the kudzu vine again as a prime example of how quickly and aggressively these species can spread.
It's a good reminder that we need to be careful about what we plant and to be on the lookout for invasive species in our community.
Early detection and rapid response are key to managing invasive species. The longer we wait, the harder it becomes to control them.
The guidebook also talks about the importance of public awareness. We need to educate ourselves and our communities about the dangers of invasive species and what we can do to prevent their spread.
It really is a collective effort. We all have a role to play in protecting our native ecosystem.
And speaking of collective efforts, The guidebook touches on a topic that I think is often overlooked: the relationship between tree management and public health.
That's a really important connection. Trees have a huge impact on our health and well-being in ways we don't always think about. They clean our air, reduce noise pollution, provide shade, and even encourage physical activity.
The guidebook mentions a study that found people living in areas with more trees have lower rates of cardiovascular disease and respiratory problems.
It's a great example of how nature isn't just something nice to have around. It's essential for our health and well-being.
And as our cities become more and more densely populated, the role of urban forests in mitigating the negative impacts of urban living will only become more important.
Absolutely. We need to start thinking about trees as part of our public health infrastructure, just like hospitals and parks.
And of course, we've already talked about the economic benefits of trees, reducing energy costs, increasing property values, boosting tourism.
It's clear that trees aren't just good for the environment, they're good for our wallets too.
So it seems like there are so many reasons to appreciate and protect trees. And speaking of protecting trees, let's dive back into the topic of climate change.
Okay, that's a big one. Trees are our allies in the fight against climate change. They absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, storing it in their wood leaves and roots.
The guidebook mentions that a single tree can absorb up to 48 pounds of carbon dioxide per year. Imagine the impact of an entire forest.
It's incredible, and it's why deforestation is such a serious problem when we cut down forests. We're not just losing trees, we're losing carbon sinks that are crucial for regulating our climate.
The guidebook highlights several strategies for using trees to combat climate change, including afforestation, reforestation, and agroforestry.
Afforestation is about planting trees in areas where they haven't existed for a long time, while reforestation focuses on restoring forests that have been degraded or destroyed. And agroforestry is all about integrating trees into agricultural systems, creating a more sustainable and productive landscape.
It sounds like all of these strategies are focused on maximizing the carbon sequestration potential of trees.
Exactly, and these approaches are gaining traction worldwide. It's not just about planting trees, though, it's about managing them in a way that enhances their carbon storage capacity.
The guidebook also mentions the potential of bioengineered trees, which sounds pretty futuristic.
It is a fascinating area of research. Scientists are exploring ways to engineer trees that can absorb even more carbon dioxide or that are more resistant to the stresses of climate change.
It's a reminder that we need to be innovative and creative in our approach to tackling climate change, and trees can be a powerful tool in our arsenal.
Absolutely. Trees are a gift, and it's our responsibility to protect and utilize them wisely. And speaking of wisdom, I think it's important to acknowledge the role of indigenous communities in tree management.
That's a great point. Indigenous communities around the world have been managing forests sustainably for centuries. They have a deep understanding of these ecosystems and a wealth of traditional knowledge that's invaluable for modern forestry.
You're right. The guidebook highlights several examples of how indigenous communities are using traditional practices from controlled burns to selective harvesting to manage their forests. These practices have been honed over generations and are often more effective and sustainable than modern methods.
The guidebook also mentions the importance of respecting indigenous land rights and involving indigenous communities in decision-making processes related to forestry.
It's about recognizing that indigenous communities are often the best stewards of their own land. Their knowledge and experience are essential for effective forest management.
And it's about ensuring that the benefits of forestry are shared equitably with indigenous communities.
Exactly. It's about justice, sustainability, and recognizing the interconnectedness of all living things. And speaking of organizations working to protect forests, let's not forget about the role of conservation organizations.
Right. Those groups play a vital role in protecting and managing our forests. They work on so many different levels, advocating for policy changes, carrying out on-the-ground conservation efforts, and raising awareness about the importance of forests.
The guidebook highlights some of the big international organizations like the Rainforest Foundation and the World Wildlife Fund, which are working to protect forests around the world.
Those organizations are doing amazing work, often in very challenging and dangerous conditions. They're fighting deforestation, illegal logging, and the impacts of climate change.
And it's important to remember those local conservation groups too. There are countless organizations working at the grassroots level to plant trees, restore degraded forests, and educate communities about forest conservation.
Those local groups are often underfunded and understaffed, but they make a huge difference in their community.
It's a reminder that we can all make a difference, whether it's through donating to a conservation organization, volunteering our time, or simply being more mindful of our own impact on forests.
And speaking of different approaches to forest management, The guidebook takes a look at some specific examples of practices from around the world.
One fascinating example is the reforestation project in Costa Rica. We mentioned this earlier, but it's worth highlighting again. This country was once losing its forests at an alarming rate, but thanks to government policies and community involvement, they actually managed to reverse deforestation and significantly increase their forest cover.
It's a remarkable success story and proof that positive change is possible.
Another interesting example is the sustainable forestry practices in Sweden. They have a long history of managing their forests for both economic and ecological benefit, using techniques like selective logging and replanting to ensure the long-term health and productivity of their forests.
It sounds like a model that other countries could learn a lot from, but with all the challenges facing forests today, it makes you wonder what the future of tree management will look like.
That's a big question. As we've discussed, climate change is one of the biggest challenges we face. It's already having a significant impact on forests around the world, and those impacts are only going to intensify in the coming years.
The guidebook mentions that we're seeing changes in tree growth pattern, more frequent pest and disease outbreak, and even shifts in the distribution of tree species.
And these changes are happening faster than many species can adapt, which is a major concern.
It's a sobering thought, but there's also a lot of exciting research and innovation happening in the field of forestry.
Absolutely. One area that's particularly promising is the development of climate-resilient tree species. Scientists are working to identify and breed trees that are more tolerant of drought, heat, and other stresses associated with climate change.
And the guidebook also talks about the increasing use of drones and other technologies for forest monitoring and management.
These technologies are giving us new tools to track the health of our forests, identify areas of concern, and respond more effectively to threats.
It really feels like an exciting time to be involved in forestry. We have more knowledge and tools than ever before to make a real difference.
You're right, and it's more important than ever that we do. So the health of our forests is inextricably linked to the health of our planet.
Wow, it really is incredible how much we rely on forests. Even if we don't always realize it. We've covered a ton of information in this deep dive, but I think it's worth taking a moment to recap some of the key takeaways.
Yeah, I agree. It's easy to get lost in the details sometimes. It's good to step back and see the bigger picture.
Absolutely. So what would you say are the most important things to remember about trees and forest management?
Well, I think the first takeaway is that trees are so much more than just sources of timber. They played a vital role in our ecosystems, our economy, and even our personal health and well-being.
It's like we've been saying throughout this whole deep dive, it's all interconnected.
Exactly. And because of that interconnectedness, we need to manage forests responsibly, thinking about the long-term health of the ecosystem and the needs of future generations.
The guidebook really emphasizes sustainable forestry practices like selective logging, replanting, and agroforestry.
Right. Those practices are all about finding a balance between human needs and the needs of the forest. It's not about exploiting forests, it's about working with them.
And we also need to be proactive in addressing the threats facing our forests, whether it's invasive species or climate change.
Absolutely. Early detection, rapid response, and collaboration are key to tackling those challenges effectively.
It sounds like there's a lot we can do both individually and collectively to protect and preserve our forests.
There really is. And I think it's important to remember that forests aren't just about trees, they're about people too.
That's a great point. Forests provide livelihoods, cultural value, and a sense of connection to the natural world for so many people around the globe.
And that human connection is something we need to celebrate and nurture.
Well said. This deep dive has really opened my eyes to the incredible complexity and importance of trees and forests. I hope our listeners feel the same way.
Me too. It's been a fascinating journey. And if anyone wants to keep exploring this topic, I highly recommend checking out The Modern Man's Guide to Forestry. It's available on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books. It's full of even more insights into this incredible world.
Great suggestion. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of trees, everyone. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration. Until then, stay curious.